Ever wondered what it was really like to be an ancient Egyptian pharaoh? All that gold, power, and glory. Well, turns out it wasn't all grand pyramids and godlike praise. In this video, we're going deep into the surprisingly stressful, uncomfortable, and downright exhausting life of the so-called most powerful person in ancient Egypt. From backbreaking rituals to political paranoia, we're peeling back the golden mask. Before you get too comfortable, make sure you've hit that subscribe button and drop your city name and local time in the comments, so we'll know where in the world you're watching us from. Let's be honest, when we hear the word pharaoh, we imagine gold power pyramids, maybe even a cobra crown, and servants waving palm leaves. It all sounds like the dream life, right? But peel back the golden mask, and you'll find something very different. Underneath being a pharaoh wasn't all luxury and leisure. It was responsibility, fear, and the constant crushing weight of divine expectations. Let's start at the beginning. The very moment a pharaoh took the throne. First off, forget childhood. If you were a royal heir, your life was never really your own. From the moment you could walk, you were being trained, not loved, not nurtured, but shaped like a political statue. Your tutors drilled you in hieroglyphics, astronomy, warfare, ritual chants, public etiquette, and of course, how to sit perfectly still while people bowed for an uncomfortably long time. By the age of 10 or 12, you were already attending council meetings and learning how to command grown men who could crush you with a flick of their hand. Childhood was a luxury you didn't have. When your father, the pharaoh, died, your promotion came with a funeral. Not just his funeral, but your own, metaphorically speaking, because the moment you wore that crown, you stopped being a person. You were now Horus on earth, the living God King. People bowed, yes, but they also expected you to know everything, to never be wrong, to keep the Nile flowing, the crops growing, the temples funded, the armies victorious, and the people happy, all while looking stoic in 110-degree heat, covered in gold zones. Glamorous. It wasn't. Imagine waking up every day knowing that a bad flood, a failed harvest, or a strange comet in the sky could mean one thing: the gods are angry at you. You couldn't get sick. You couldn't cry. You definitely couldn't mess up, because any sign of weakness was considered a bad omen for the entire kingdom. A single mistake could lead to riots, rebellion, or famine. You were the human light switch for chaos, and there was no off-duty button. Even your mornings weren't your own. You didn't wake up and stretch in bed like a normal human. No, you were awoken by priests chanting your name, attendants washing you in ritual oils, and officials already standing at your door demanding decisions about everything from tomb construction schedules to taxes on fishmongers. And no, you couldn't just say, "I'll deal with it later." Pharaohs didn't get breaks, but perhaps the worst part, you were surrounded every day by people who lied to your face. Court officials, generals, advisors, they all flattered you. Not because they loved you, but because they feared you, or worse, they wanted something. And since no one could disagree with a god king, you were never sure who to trust. Imagine trying to govern a country when you can't even trust your own family. Even your siblings could be plotting to poison you just to grab your throne, and many did. In Egyptian history, more than one pharaoh died under mysterious palace circumstances. Doesn't sound like a relaxing reign, does it now? Let's talk health. Being pharaoh didn't protect you from the very real dangers of ancient Egyptian medicine, which was more trial and error than treatment. You'd think the king of Egypt would have access to the best healthcare in the world. In reality, you'd be prescribed moldy bread for infections, crushed beetles for stomach aches, and crocodile dung to help with fertility. Don't ask dental care. Absolutely non-existent pharaohs often died with abscessed gums, missing teeth, and chronic pain. Some mummies have been found with dozens of cavities, as their royal diet was loaded with honey dates and gritty bread that wore down. Enamel divine or not, the pharaoh's mouth was a disaster. And then there were the rituals. So many rituals. From sunrise to sunset, Your day was chopped into slices of ceremonial obligations. You had to personally attend temple ceremonies, oversee offerings, recite divine praises, and sometimes even play the part of gods in complex religious dramas. It wasn't optional. If you skipped a festival, it wasn't seen as poor attendance. It was blasphemy, and this leads us to one of the most suffocating parts of being Pharaoh. You weren't allowed to be human. Love, you had to marry your sister literally. To preserve the royal bloodline, pharaohs often married close relatives, sometimes multiple wives, sometimes all at once. The personal cost of these marriages was immense. You couldn't marry for love. You married for politics. And often the women you married were being controlled by the same advisors who whispered in your ear. Even romance was strategy and privacy. Gone. You were always being watched by your guards, your servants, your priests, even the gods themselves. Every movement had meaning. Even sneezing could be interpreted as a divine message. You had to maintain an image of calm order and control, even if inside you were breaking. Worse still, pharaohs were expected to think beyond death. You couldn't just rule. You had to prepare for eternity. That meant building a tomb the size of a mountain while you are still alive. A monument so large, it could take decades. And thousands of workers to finish the pyramids weren't just grand architecture. They were a pharaoh's panic bunker for the afterlife. And you'd have to plan it all while managing an empire. So, what happened if you failed? If the people starved? If the Nile didn't flood? If the priests turned against? You might be remembered not as a god, but as a failure. Your name could be scraped off monuments. Your statues toppled, your tomb defaced. That was the ancient Egyptian version of being cancelled, erased from history, erased from eternity. That's right. If the priests decided you had offended the gods, they could deny you an afterlife. Even in death, the pressure didn't stop. So, before we go any further, just take this: in being Pharaoh was not a golden vacation on a throne made of jewels. It was more like being a CEO, religious leader, military commander, and PR spokesperson, all rolled into one. And if anything went wrong, it was all your fault. Not just in this life, but forever. Step inside the palace walls of ancient Egypt, and you might expect luxury beyond imagination. Gold-plated everything, dancers in every hallway, endless feasts, and loyal subjects fawning at your feet. And sure, the palace looked beautiful, polished. Alabaster floors, painted ceilings, and carvings of your own face, smiling back at you on every pillar. But underneath the sparkle, the palace was more of a cage than a kingdom. It was a place where every breath was measured, every step was planned, and every moment belonged to someone else. First, let's talk about the noise. Not the kind from the streets or the Nile outside. No, palace noise was constant activity, advisors murmuring in corners, scribes scratching on papyrus, servants hustling between chambers, guards clanking weapons as they switched posts every hour. Even in your so-called private quarters, there were attendants everywhere. You couldn't even sneeze without someone rushing in with an amulet and a bowl of herbs. Quiet was a rare luxury and privacy that didn't exist for a pharaoh. And then there were the decisions, thousands of them, every day. From sunup to sundown, officials brought you petitions from cities you'd never even seen. A dispute over farmland in Nubia, a priest demanding more gold for the crocodile god. Sobek, a craftsman begging for tax exemption because his tools were stolen by river thieves. You had to pretend to care about every single one, because even the smallest issue could spark unrest if ignored. Pharaohs didn't just sit on the throne. They were the court of final appeal, the economic strategist, the judge, the problem solver, and the living embodiment of Mayat, divine order. And while you were making all these decisions, you had to keep up appearances. You couldn't slump in your chair. You couldn't yawn. You couldn't say, "Let's take a break." You had to wear your heavy crown or headdress for hours during ceremonies. Your robes were stiff with gold thread, and your jewelry weighed pounds. Imagine trying to focus on tax policy while balancing a solid gold collar on your shoulders. It wasn't fashion, It was armor. Performance meals weren't a time to relax either. Sure, the food looked impressive: platters of roasted duck, honey cakes, fresh figs, and lotus wine. But every bite was suspicious. Poisoning was not rare in palace politics. The richer the dish, the more dangerous it could be. Pharaohs often had food tasters, but even that wasn't foolproof. Your enemies could be within your own kitchen staff. Every meal could be your last supper, and who were your enemies exactly? That's the tricky part. Everyone and no one. The palace was full of smiling faces hiding sharp ambitions. Your half-brother, who bowed a little too deeply. He might be waiting for your army to falter. The high priest, who advised you to raise taxes for the temple. He might be trying to turn the people against you. Even your own children weren't above suspicion. Because in a world where the crown meant godhood, even family could become fatal competition. And yet, for all this stress, you were expected to be inspiring. You had to visit the schools and pretend to be interested in children's songs. You had to inspect temple construction and praise the builders even if they were weeks behind schedule. You had to lead ceremonies for the gods, stand before crowds, wave like you meant it, and smile like nothing was wrong. Even if your back hurt, your enemies were plotting, and your last 5 meals had tasted like ashlets. Not forget, you were always on display. Your likeness was everywhere, on statues, on walls, on temple columns. Every time someone looked at a monument, they saw you. So your appearance had to be tightly controlled. That meant daily makeup, yes, even for male pharaohs. Kohl around the eyes to ward off evil spirits. Henna to tint the fingers, and carefully applied perfumes made from lotus, frankincense, or myrrh. You weren't allowed to look tired or sick. You had to look eternal. But under the coal and gold, many pharaohs were deeply isolated. Real friendships were nearly impossible. Everyone either feared you, envied you, or wanted something from you. And if you did find someone you trusted, even that came with danger. Showing favoritism could start a court scandal. Your trusted friend could be accused of sorcery, treason, or seducing the royal wife, all common charges that required zero evidence. One whisper in the wrong ear, and your friend could disappear overnight. You might never even find out who ordered it. You just received a scroll saying justice had been done. Marriage, too, was complicated. You may have had dozens of wives and concubines, but love wasn't the goal. Producing heirs was, and producing sons especially. But even that was a delicate game. Too many sons. A bloody succession crisis waiting to happen. Too few panic over the end of the dynasty. And every wife had her own family, her own ambitions, her own priestly connections. Your bedroom became a political chessboard where every move could shift the future of Egypt. Even leisure had strings attached. Let's say you wanted to go hunting, one of the few activities pharaohs genuinely enjoyed. You couldn't just grab a bow and sneak out into the desert. You had to organize a royal hunting party, inform the priests to bless the journey, take guards, scribes, fan-bearers, and probably a few nosy officials who turn it into a performance. Your kill would be recorded by artists and turned into wall carvings. What was supposed to be relaxing became another scripted event for public consumption and illness. You couldn't show it. If you felt weak, you were expected to hide it. Some pharaohs disappeared from public view entirely, when sick, issuing decrees through officials, while rumors spread like wildfire. Was the pharaoh dying? Had he angered the gods? Had someone cursed him? The pressure to look immortal was exhausting. And when it'd finally die, you weren't even allowed to rest. Your body was embalmed, dried, stuffed, painted, wrapped, and placed in a tomb filled with spells to guide your soul through the afterlife. Even your bones were expected to keep performing. So no, the palace wasn't a palace. It was a stage, a prison made of marble, gold, and expectations. Every wall echoed with rules. Every hallway was lined with politics. You were the center of everything, and yet completely alone. When people talk about the glory of ancient Egypt, they talk about the pyramids, the treasures, the temples, the gods. But rarely do they talk about the person trapped inside all that glory, the pharaoh, who was supposed to be divine, but was really just human, exhausted and stuck. Being pharaoh wasn't just about politics and palaces. It was about the Nile. That one single river decided the fate of your entire kingdom. If it flooded, too much disaster. If it didn't flood, enough famine. And guess who the people blamed for any of it? You, the pharaoh, the so-called living god. Because in the eyes of the people, you didn't just rule Egypt. You were supposed to balance it. Nature was part of your job description. The ancient Egyptians didn't separate religion and science like we do today. To them, everything was connected. A good harvest meant the gods were pleased. A bad one meant someone had messed up, probably you. If locusts swarmed the crops or hippos destroyed farmland, that wasn't just nature misbehaving. It was seen as a sign that the sacred balance of the universe, had been broken. And guess who was responsible for keeping intact? The pharaoh. So, how did this pressure play out in daily life? Well, for starters, every year began with a simple question: how high would the Nile rise? Egyptian life revolved around the river's flooding cycle. Inundation brought fresh silt and made the land fertile. No flood, no food. No flood, also no food. The sweet spot was incredibly narrow. There was even a nilometer, an actual measurement system that priests and officials used to record the height of the floodwaters. You could imagine how everyone held their breath as they watched the markings rise day after day. If they were too low or too high, panic started to simmer, and it oiled over into your court. People didn't just complain, they prayed at you, farmers. Priests, nobles, they brought offerings hoping to sway your favor, as if you personally had a dial for the river. Some even begged you to walk among the fields, or touch the earth with your sandals. They believed your presence alone might convince the gods to show mercy, and if it didn't work, your divine status got shaky real fast. A bad flood year meant more than just angry farmers. It meant empty granaries. Empty granaries meant starving people, and starving people meant rebellion. Even the most powerful pharaohs feared grain shortages. That's why you had officials tracking harvests, managing reserves, and collecting taxes in grain instead of money. Food was currency. Food was stability, and without it, your divine rule turned into a human catastrophe. And then came the public blame. Remember, pharaohs were thought to be divine conduits to the gods. When life went wrong, the people didn't turn to science. They turned to superstition. They whispered in markets and temples. Maybe the pharaoh has sinned. Maybe he's not pure. Maybe the gods are angry at him. These weren't just rumors. They were dangerous, because if too many people believed them, they could spark revolts, temple walkouts, or even coups. All because a river didn't cooperate. The priests didn't help either. Egyptian religion wasn't unified under a single temple. Each region had its own gods, its own rituals, and its own powerful priesthoods. And while they served the pharaoh in name, they often acted as political rivals. A priesthood, especially one from a wealthy temple, say Amun in Thebes, could use a bad flood year to gain leverage. They might say, the pharaoh must donate more gold to our temple to restore the gods' favor. It was spiritual blackmail, and it worked over time. Some temples became richer and more powerful than the palace itself. Pharaohs had to play politics with the very people who claimed to speak for the heavens. Meanwhile, back in the palace, you were expected to act fast. You'd have to commission grand ceremonies, sometimes offering entire herds of cattle to the gods in public displays of repentance. You'd sponsor new temples, engrave new prayers, stage fake divine dreams to show the gods still loved you. And all the while, your advisors whispered conflicting opinions, raise taxes here, lower rations there, conscript laborers, appease nobles, silence priests. It was damage control wrapped in incense and chaos. And when it wasn't the river, it was the desert. Egypt may have been rich in culture and resources, but it was surrounded by deadly landscapes, sandstorms, heat waves, droughts, bandit tribes that raided border towns. You had to fund patrols to protect your people, build wells to survive long dry seasons, and station military outposts in places most people wouldn't even visit. Voluntarily, if anything went wrong in these remote regions, if travelers vanished, if caravans failed to return, it was seen as your failure to protect the kingdom. You didn't get credit when things went right, but you sure got blamed when they didn't. Natural disasters weren't even the only things in nature you had to fear. Plagues were regular visitors. Swarms of insects, deadly fevers, strange illnesses no one could explain. All of these could bring life to a standstill. And since medicine was more guesswork than science, your doctors would show up with jars of animal fat and prayer scrolls. Meanwhile, the public demanded answers. Why are the gods punishing us? They'd ask. What has the pharaoh done? And here's the chilling part: you might believe it too, because pharaohs weren't just pretending to be divine. They were raised to believe it. From birth, you were told you were chosen by the gods, that your blood was sacred, that your soul would rise to the stars and join Ra in the afterlife. So when things went wrong, when the crops failed or the temples burned, it shook your faith in yourself. You weren't just afraid of losing the crown. You were afraid that maybe you weren't worthy of it. Oh, make matters worse, there was no one to talk to about it. You couldn't confide in your advisors. They'd see it as weakness. You couldn't talk to your family. They were either competition or political hostages. The priests would just double down on ceremonies and tell you to do more. You were the one person in all of Egypt who couldn't say, "I'm overwhelmed," and yet you had to keep the performance going. Because to show fear was to invite chaos. The pharaoh was supposed to radiate order. That was the contract. As long as you acted like you were in control, the world stayed balanced. But the moment you slipped, the moment you cried or stumbled or hesitated, that illusion shattered. So every time the Nile flooded too low and the granaries ran dry, and the people grew hungry, and the priests grew louder, you didn't get to grieve. You didn't get to scream. You got up, put on your golden collar, and walked out to face a crowd that wanted answers from a man who barely had the strength to stand it. Wasn't just hard to be pharaoh. It was exhausting, lonely, unforgiving. And nowhere did that weight feel heavier than in the natural world, where every rising sun, every gust of wind, every drop of water somehow became your responsibility. By now we've seen how the pharaoh wasn't living in some fantasy, carved out of gold and worship. He was trapped in an image, not just the image of a king, but of a god, a walking deity. But here's the terrifying twist: while the people worshipped you, while the priests declared you divine, while statues showed you immortal and perfect, you were still made of flesh. You could bleed, you could break, and most of all, you could die. But that wasn't the version anyone wanted to see. The entire empire operated on the idea that the pharaoh was untouchable, not just politically, but spiritually. You were Horus in life, Osiris in death. Your breath was sacred, your words were law, and your body was a symbol of eternal strength. So what happened when that body started to fail? Let's start with something simple. Ajingas. Pharaoh, you weren't supposed to grow old. Not visibly, at least. The paintings and statues made sure of that. Whether you ruled for 10 years or 40, your official image always stayed the same: youthful, sharp-jawed, powerful. But reality was slower. Your joints ached from standing through endless ceremonies. Your eyesight faded while squinting over scrolls. Your back tensed after hours of riding chariots or sitting through court. There were no yoga sessions or ergonomic chairs in ancient Egypt, and no one dared ask, "Are you feeling all right, Your Majesty?" Because acknowledging your weakness was taboo. Instead, your decline had to be hidden, masked with heavy makeup, perfumes, wigs, and posture. You couldn't limp through the palace. You couldn't ask for a king. You had to walk like a god, even if your legs screamed with pain. You had to sit tall, even when you barely had the strength to hold up your head. And when your hands trembled from age or sickness, servants quietly stepped in to hold scrolls for you. without ever speaking a word now. Illness was a different nightmare, because disease didn't care how many temples were built in your name. Ancient Egypt was beautiful, yes, but it was still a world of parasites, infections, malnutrition, and mystery fevers. And pharaohs, despite their status, weren't immune. In fact, some had more health problems than commoners. Why? Because royal diets were high in sugar, rich in meat, and loaded with grit from poorly processed grain. Mummies of pharaohs have revealed arthritis, clogged arteries, and horrific dental disease. Some died in their 30s, others in their 20s. Tutankhamun, for example, likely suffered from multiple congenital conditions, and he was dead before age 20. But again, no one could admit it. Pharaoh was sick, so what happened instead? You were in retreat. That was the official phrase. You had entered meditation with the gods. Or perhaps you were resting in the sacred chambers. In reality, you were vomiting in a basin, or coughing up blood, or lying on your side, while a physician fanned incense around your bed and muttered protective spells. Ancient medicine had few cures, and most of them involved prayer charms, or things like honey mixed with crushed insects. Some treatments helped, many didn't, and if you died, oh, then the real drama began. You'd think death would offer rest, but not for a pharaoh. The moment your last breath left your body, a countdown began. Your embalming had to start immediately. Your priests began reading from the Book of the Dead, guiding your soul through the underworld. Your organs were removed and placed in canopic jars, each guarded by one of Horus's sons. Your body was dried with natron for 40 days. Then it was oiled, wrapped in linen, painted, and dressed in gold. Your funeral mask, crafted to hide the decay underneath, had to show you looking perfect, eternal lie. All this because the people couldn't see the pharaoh rot. Not even in death. Your image still had to be preserved, or the illusion of divine rule might collapse. And more importantly, your soul had work to do. According to Egyptian belief, the soul had to pass a test in the underworld. You would stand before Osiris, the god of the dead, while your heart was weighed against a feather. If your heart was heavy with sin, lies, cruelty, failure, you'd be devoured by a monster and cease to exist. If your heart was light, if you had ruled with Maat, you'd pass into the field of reeds, a paradise of endless peace. But think about that for a moment. Even in death, you weren't guaranteed peace. If your afterlife was determined by how justly you ruled, then every decision you made while alive mattered forever. You couldn't just rule for survival. You had to rule with purity. One lie, one act of cruelty, one unjust execution, and your heart might betray you in front of the gods. And there's something even darker. Some pharaohs didn't make it into history. Literally, they were erased in Egypt. Your name was power. It was carved into monuments, painted on tombs, spoken in rituals. But if you failed politically, spiritually, or militarily, priests could order your name scratched out, statues were broken, faces chipped off, records rewritten. You were scrubbed from memory. And without your name remembered, your soul couldn't survive in the afterlife. That's what happened to Akhenaten. After his controversial religious reforms, his successors worked hard to erase him. Even today, we only know about him because some traces survived. Imagine that you rule for decades. You build monuments, fight wars, make sacrifices. And if the wrong people outlive you, your entire existence is undone. No tomb, no name, no afterlife. That was the true horror of being pharaoh. You weren't living for yourself. You were living for legacy, for ritual, for illusion. You couldn't cry, get sick, grow old, or die without someone scripting it, polishing it, sanitizing it for the record. You were both the actor and the myth, and this brings us to a strange irony. As pharaoh, you had more power than any commoner could imagine. You could raise armies, change laws, build temples, command worship, but you couldn't say, "I'm tired." You couldn't be weak. You couldn't be honest. Even as a god, you were still a prisoner, trapped in a role that demanded perfection from a person who was anything but perfect. The people didn't want a man. They wanted a miracle, and the palace didn't want a leader. It wanted a legend. So you smiled, you ruled, you fought, you prayed, and all the while you carried the silent fear that someday someone might look back at your reign and say, "He-W." If you were a pharaoh, your entire life was haunted by your death. The moment you took the throne, the countdown began, not just to the end of your reign, but to the building of your tomb. Because in ancient Egypt, your final resting place wasn't just a box underground. It was a mountain of stone, a fortress of rituals, and a desperate bid for immortality. And you, the most powerful man in the kingdom, are also its most obsessed architect of death. Let's talk pyramids. These weren't just graves. They were propaganda, legacy, and spiritual technology, all rolled into one. Every stone was a declaration. This king matters. Every corridor and chamber was a map of the cosmos. But here's what they don't tell you. Pyramids were logistical nightmares. Constructing one took decades, tens of thousands of workers, and enough resources to feed entire cities. And yet if the pharaoh died before it was finished, the tomb might be rushed, flawed, or even abandoned, which meant your legacy or eternity could collapse with a single misplaced stone. So the pressure was immense. One of your first tasks as pharaoh was to choose a site for your tomb. The desert had to be stable, not too close to flood zones, but near enough to the Nile for supplies and labor. Then came the planning: internal chambers, air shafts, sacred passages aligned with the stars. You'd work with priests, astronomers, and architects, not because you were interested in design, but because getting it wrong meant eternal doom. This wasn't about luxury. It was survival in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed the soul had many parts, Ka, Ba, Ak, and all of them needed shelter. The body had to be perfectly preserved, the tomb filled with spells and offerings, the name carved deep into stone so it could be spoken forever. One crack in the wall, one botched mummification, one missing ritual, and your spirit could become trapped in darkness for all time. That's why pharaohs didn't just order tombs, they micromanaged them. Every chamber had to be painted with specific scenes: hunting, feasting, divine blessings. It wasn't decoration. It was a spiritual instruction manual. And what about all those laborers? Popular myths say slaves built the pyramids, but evidence suggests most were skilled workers, farmers during flood season, and laborers housed in massive temporary villages. But make no mistake, their lives were brutal, backbreaking. Days under a punishing sun, hauling multi-ton stones, living on beer and onions, plagued by injuries, and all of it, every ounce of sweat, was for your tomb. That's the strange contradiction. Pharaohs built entire cities just to die, and they did it while alive. You couldn't wait until your old age to start preparing for death. If you did, you'd run out of time. That's why even teenage kings had tombs under construction before their voices had finished changing. Death wasn't something to fear. It was a deadline, and it loomed constantly. The deeper you got into your reign, the more death became your obsession. You collected amulets and funerary texts. You oversaw temple offerings that would charge your soul with power. You consulted the priests on what spells needed to be buried with you. You commissioned statues, not for art, but as spiritual backups, so that if your body decayed, your spirit could still recognize itself in stone and continue on to the afterlife. And came the most eerie part: you visited your own grave while still alive. Pharaohs would inspect their tombs regularly, walk through the corridors, approve the paintings, sit silently in rooms carved for their sarcophagus. Imagine that, touring the place where your body would one day rot, giving feedback like a man adjusting a hotel reservation. Move the stele over there. Let's make the stars brighter in this chamber. Add another image of Ra above the false door. But it wasn't just about the tomb. Death required a kingdom-wide performance. You had to build mortuary temples for priests to serve your spirit. You had to secure farmland to fund offerings forever. Yes, forever. If no one fed your spirit in the afterlife, it would wither. So you had to write legal documents, guaranteeing offerings of bread, beer, meat, and incense until the end of time. You had to think beyond your own life, beyond even your children's, and make sure some teenager, 500 years later, would still be placing bread on your altar. The anxiety was endless, and the competition ruthless. Every pharaoh wanted a bigger tomb, more lavish offerings, more divine scenes painted on their walls. You were constantly reminded of who came before you. Their pyramids loomed on the horizon like stone ghosts. Khufu, Djoser, Neferu. They weren't just dead kings, they were benchmarks. If your tomb didn't measure up, your reign was a failure. But there was one more layer of fear. Theft, robbery was common. Despite all your efforts, your carefully built pyramid could be broken into within a generation. Gold stolen, mummies desecrated, names erased. Some pharaohs tried to combat this by building false chambers, trapdoors, hidden corridors. Others buried themselves far away from the main pyramids, like in the Valley of the Kings, hoping secrecy would protect them. But nothing was foolproof. Even the most sophisticated tombs were eventually breached. And with every rumor of theft, your priests panicked. Not because of the treasure, but because your soul was now at risk. Imagine that you spent your life building a fortress for your afterlife, and some poor grave robber with a chisel could undo it all in a single night. And all the while, the pressure to appear calm never faded. You couldn't walk around stressed about dying. You had to pretend you were above it, that you were secure in your legacy, that your soul would sail the stars with Ra no matter what. But inside, you were just another human scrambling to prepare for a future you'd never see. Most tragic irony of all, many of these pharaohs, despite all their planning, are still unknown today. Their tombs collapsed, their names faded. Their monuments were repurposed by later kings, and now they lie in pieces, bones, in museums. Coffins with question marks, lost among the noise of time. Meanwhile, the workers who toiled under their sun, whose names were never written down, those workers built something that still stands. That's the cruel truth of history. You can pour your soul into a pyramid, build it from the ground up, fill it with spells and gold and prayers, and still be forgotten. So, when you think of the Great Pyramid, don't just picture a triangle against the sky. Picture a man who walked its corridors while still alive, who stared at his own tomb walls and wondered if it would be enough, who ruled millions but couldn't escape the simplest fact of all: he was going to die, and all the power in Egypt couldn't change that. By the end of a pharaoh's reign, his legacy was meant to be eternal. Tombs were filled with gold, elaborate carvings, spells from the Book of the Dead, and promises of divine rebirth. But behind those grand monuments and glittering treasures was often a very human man, one who had aged beneath a golden crown, whose body was broken by the weight of ceremonial expectations, political manipulation, and the burden of being treated as a living god. Take the infamous Pharaoh Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great. His reign lasted over 60 years, and his monuments dot the Egyptian landscape, from the towering colossi of Abu Simbel to the sprawling temples at Karnak and Luxor. Ramses ensured his name would not be forgotten, and yet for all his architectural achievements and military campaigns, he outlived many of his wives and children. His twilight years were not filled with peace, but with the aches of age and the eerie silence of a court that had slowly emptied of familiar faces. Those final days, pharaohs often faced their own mortality head-on. Ancient Egyptian belief didn't just promise an afterlife, it demanded proof of worthiness. The weighing of the heart ceremony, guided by the god Anubis, tested whether one's deeds had been just and pure. Imagine the psychological toll. A man who had ordered executions, engaged in political purges, taxed the poor, and ruled through fear, now lying in a palace chamber, wondering if the scales would tip in his favor. Was Mat, the goddess of truth and order, truly pleased, or had he been living a lie under the illusion of divine rule? even death was complicated. Pharaohs weren't simply buried. They were embalmed in rituals that lasted 70 days. Their brains were pulled out through the nose, their organs removed, and their bodies stuffed with resins and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen. All of this was meant to preserve them for the afterlife. But one has to wonder, did any pharaoh lie awake in there? Final nights fearing the knives of their embalmers, trusting the same priests who had bowed for decades, but perhaps now whispered about their successor. And then came the tomb, the final home of a god king. While we think of the pyramids or the grand chambers of the Valley of the Kings, the truth was often far less glamorous. Grave robbers were an epidemic, despite elaborate traps. Secret passageways and curses inscribed on walls. Nearly every royal tomb was looted within a few centuries. Of burial, some were robbed within weeks. The gold amulets, the sacred scrolls, the bejeweled masks, all stripped away. Pharaohs who had demanded to be remembered for eternity were reduced to naked corpses tossed aside by thieves with torches. King Tutankhamun is the rare exception. His tomb, hidden and largely untouched for over 3,000 years, became a global sensation when it was discovered in 1922. But even Tut's body told a tragic story. His bones were fragile. His skull was misshapen. His leg was broken, likely from a chariot crash. And his early death at 18 was filled with physical suffering. Here was the boy king of legend, yet his life was brief and painful, and his rule likely controlled by priests and viziers behind the curtain. Afterlife, according to Egyptian belief, wasn't automatic. The dead had to journey through the underworld battling serpents, navigating lakes of fire, and reciting dozens of spells just to reach the field of reeds. This wasn't some blissful paradise gifted to anyone of status. It was an obstacle course of cosmic judgment. And despite all their treasures and titles, a pharaoh's success in the afterlife came down to whether his heart was lighter than a feather. Imagine being a king who'd lived with the weight of empires on his shoulders, now worrying whether his heart was metaphorically and literally too heavy. What if the lies he told, the orders he gave, the suffering he allowed had built up over time, like sand filling a tomb? What if the gods were not fooled by gold, and beyond the spiritual fears, there was another unsettling truth? No matter how divine they claimed to be, pharaohs were almost always forgotten. Their names were chiseled off monuments by rival dynasties. Their statues defaced, their histories rewritten. Akhenaten, the radical ruler who worshipped a single god, was so thoroughly erased from official history that archaeologists only rediscovered his existence centuries later. Hatshepsut, a powerful female pharaoh, had her images smashed and her legacy buried under layers of male successors. So despite building temples, writing scrolls, and surrounding themselves with eternal symbols, the memory of many pharaohs didn't last more than a few generations. In the end, the sand reclaimed everything, all that ceremony, all that ritual, all that divine status. It couldn't shield them from being human. Being pharaoh wasn't just hard. It was lonely, dangerous, morally fraught, and ultimately a race against time and memory. They may have been worshipped as gods, but they died as men, wrapped in linen, buried in stone, and often forgotten by the very world they ruled. So next time you see a golden mask, a towering obelisk, or a crumbling pyramid, remember, behind every monument was a mortal, and being that mortal being a pharaoh wasn't the dream we imagine. It was often a nightmare with a crown.